The biting wind of a late November evening clawed at Detective Sergeant Miles Corbin as he stepped out of his unmarked cruiser. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, seemed to press in on him, mirroring the weight that had settled in his gut. Before him, the sprawling Gothic silhouette of St. Augustine's Asylum loomed against the bruised twilight sky. Its stone facade, stained with years of neglect and rain, seemed to watch him with empty, ancient eyes. This wasn't just another case. This was a descent into a place where sanity was a luxury and history bled through the walls. Miles pulled his trench coat tighter, the worn fabric offering little comfort against the chill that seeped into his bones. He'd seen his share of darkness in this city. The grime of the back alleys, the desperation in hollowed eyes, the chilling indifference of a killer. But St. Augustine's held a different kind of dread. It wasn't the kind that screamed, it was the kind that whispered, an insidious murmur that promised to unravel even the most hardened mind. He pushed open the heavy oak doors, their groan echoing through the cavernous entrance hall. The air inside was stale, a mixture of disinfectant, old paper, and something subtly metallic, the scent of forgotten things. The lighting was sparse, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. It was a place designed to disorient, to isolate. "Corbin, you're late." A gruff voice cut through the silence. Detective Sergeant Elena Ramirez emerged from the gloom, her sharp features illuminated by the weak glow of a flickering fluorescent light. She was a woman who navigated the world with a cynical grace, her skepticism a shield against the horrors they faced daily. Today, however, a faint tremor in her voice betrayed a deeper unease. "Traffic," Miles grunted, though he knew it was more than that. He'd lingered, trying to shake the feeling of impending doom that had clung to him since the call came in. "What have we got?" Elena led him down a dimly lit corridor, their footsteps echoing eerily. "Another one, Dr. Alistair Finch, head psychiatrist, found in his office just like the others." "Just like the others," Miles repeated, the words tasting like ash. This was the third unexplained death at St. Augustine's in as many months. Each victim, a prominent staff member, found in their private office, no forced entry, no obvious cause of death, just a look of pure, unadulterated terror frozen on their faces. The official reports cited heart attacks, but Miles knew better. This wasn't natural. "Anything new this time?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the peeling paint and institutional green walls. The corridor felt impossibly long, the silence punctuated only by the distant, disembodied wail of a patient. "Same M.O., Elena confirmed. "No signs of struggle, no murder weapon, no immediate cause, but there's something different." She paused before a heavy wooden door, a brass plaque reading Dr. A. Finch, tarnished with age. The scene, it's cleaner, almost sterile. Miles frowned. Cleaner. What does that even mean? Elena pushed open the door, revealing the crime scene. The office was sparse, a large mahogany desk dominating the center, flanked by overflowing bookshelves. A leather armchair faced the desk, and in it, slumped unnaturally, was Dr. Finch. His eyes, wide and unseeing, stared at the ceiling, a silent scream etched into his features. His hands were clutched to his chest, as if trying to hold something in or keep something out. But Elena was right. There was an unsettling order to everything. Papers were neatly stacked, pens meticulously aligned. There was no overturned chair, no scattered files, no indication of a struggle or a frantic last moment. It was as if Dr. Finch had simply ceased to be in the midst of his perfectly organized life. Miles approached the body, his eyes scanning every detail. He noticed a small, intricately carved wooden rosary clutched in Finch's left hand, its beads digging into his skin. "This wasn't here before, was it?" he murmured, more to himself than to Elena. Elena's brow furrowed. No, the previous victims didn't have anything like this. She gestured towards the desk. And look at this. On the polished surface of the desk, in the precise center, lay a single, dried, white rose. Its petals, brittle with age, were almost translucent. A white rose, Miles observed, a chill creeping up his spine, symbolic of purity, innocence, or death. Or a message, Elena added, her voice barely a whisper. This wasn't just a heart attack, Miles. This was deliberate. A performance. Miles ran a gloved hand over the back of his neck, feeling the prickle of unease intensify. He knelt beside Dr. Finch, examining the rosary. It looked ancient, the wood smooth from countless prayers. Any leads on who might have left this? No one saw anything. Elena sighed, frustration lacing her tone. The security cameras in this wing mysteriously malfunctioned hours before he was found, and the staff, they're terrified, whispering about her again. Her? Miles looked up, meeting Elena's troubled gaze. Sister Beatrice, Elena supplied, her voice dropping almost conspiratorially. The Macabre Nun, an urban legend among the patients and some of the older staff. A nun who supposedly worked here decades ago. They say she returned, a spectral guardian to punish those who defiled the asylum's sanctity. Miles scoffed, a habit born of years of dealing with superstitious claims. Come on, Elena. We're looking for a flesh-and-blood killer, not a ghost story. I know, she conceded, but her eyes darted nervously towards the dark corners of the office. But the staff are convinced. And the timing, it's strange, Miles. 3 deaths, all high-ranking officials, all seemingly linked to the inner workings of this place. And now, these symbolic gestures. Miles stood, his mind racing. He walked over to the bookshelves, his fingers tracing the spines of medical texts and psychological journals. He paused at a section filled with old, leather-bound tomes. One, in particular, caught his eye. It was a history of St. Augustine's Asylum, its cover faded and worn. He pulled it out, a cloud of dust puffing into the air. Flipping through the brittle pages, he found a section dedicated to the early days of the institution. A faded photograph, yellowed with age, depicted a group of nuns in their habits, tending to patients. In the center, a striking woman with intense, almost unnerving eyes stood out. Her expression was serene, yet held an undeniable intensity. Beneath the photograph, a caption read, Sister Beatrice, a devoted caregiver and spiritual guide, circa 1930s. Miles felt a cold shiver run down his spine, despite himself. The eyes in the photograph seemed to follow him, a silent accusation. He closed the book. The image of Sister Beatrice burned into his mind. We need to dig deeper into the history of this place, Miles stated, his voice firm, pushing down the nascent fear. Find out everything about Sister Beatrice, about these so-called legends. There's a pattern here, Elena. A meticulous, deliberate pattern. Elena nodded, her expression grim. I'll start pulling files, patient records, staff history, anything that might shed light on this nun. As they exited the office, the disembodied wail from earlier seemed to intensify, a long, drawn-out cry that pierced the silence. Miles glanced back at the closed door of Dr. Finch's office, then down the long, shadowed corridor. He had a chilling premonition that this case was not just about solving murders, but about unearthing a truth far more disturbing than any ghost story. The Macabre Nun, whether real or imagined, was at the heart of it, pulling the strings from the shadows, ensuring that St. Augustine's kept its secrets and claimed its next victim. The first whisper had been heard, and Miles knew with a dreadful certainty that it was only the beginning. The morning light, thin and watery, did little to dispel the gloom that clung to Miles's office. He sat hunched over a stack of yellowed files, a cold coffee cup forgotten on his desk. The files, retrieved from St. Augustine's dusty archives, offered a fragmented glimpse into its past, a timeline of neglect and forgotten promises. Elena, across from him, was immersed in patient records, a grim line etched between her eyebrows. "This place is a mess," she muttered, not looking up. "The records are incomplete, cross-referenced poorly. It's like they wanted to hide things or just didn't care." "Standard procedure for a place like that," Miles replied, flipping through an old staff log. "A revolving door of administrators all cutting corners. But I found something." He tapped a page with a list of employees from the 1930s. Sister Beatrice Dubois. She was more than just a caregiver. She was an archivist, kept detailed records of everything. "An archivist?" Elena finally looked up, intrigued. "In a place like this? That's unusual." "Exactly," Miles said, a flicker of something in his eyes. "And she was meticulous. The director's notes from that time praise her for her unwavering dedication to the spiritual well-being of the patients. But then she just disappears. No resignation, no transfer, just a single line in a log from 1941. Sister B. Dubois, deceased. No cause, no further details." Elena leaned forward, her interest piqued. Deceased, in an asylum, and no one bothered to write down how. "That's a huge red flag, Miles." "It is," he agreed. "And get this, the patient census from that period has a noticeable gap. 12 patients, all listed as having died of natural causes in a single 3-month period in 1941. 12 patients just before Sister Beatrice's disappearance." A heavy silence fell between them. The coincidence was too stark to ignore. 12 hosts, 12 graves. The title of their investigation, a phrase that had been whispered on the force, now took on a chilling, concrete meaning. "This is getting too deep for a standard investigation," Elena said, her voice low. "We need to talk to someone who was there. Anyone." Miles nodded, already ahead of her. "I've been on the phone with the asylum's current director, Dr. Evelyn Shaw. She's been there for 30 years. She remembers the stories about Sister Beatrice. Said it was all folklore, but her tone was evasive. I've got an appointment with her this afternoon." He stood, gathering the old files. "And you're going back to the asylum. I need you to find any mention of these 12 patients. Their names, their families. We need to know who they were, and why they were forgotten." The afternoon sun, though weak, cast long shadows as Miles drove back to St. Augustine's. The Gothic facade seemed even more menacing in the daylight, its silent history a palpable presence. Inside, Dr. Evelyn Shaw was waiting for him in her well-appointed office, a stark contrast to the rest of the asylum. She was a woman in her late 60s, her face a roadmap of a life spent in institutional corridors. She greeted him with a practiced but weary smile. "Detective Corbin," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "I was surprised to hear from you again. I've already provided everything in the official reports." "I'm afraid the official reports aren't enough, Dr. Shaw," Miles replied, placing the old asylum history book on her desk. He opened it to the photograph of Sister Beatrice. This woman, Sister Beatrice Dubois, she was the archivist here in the 1930s. She disappeared in 1941, just as 12 patients died under mysterious circumstances. "What can you tell me about this?" Dr. Shaw's composed facade cracked. Her eyes, which had been cool and professional, darted to the photograph and then back to Miles, a flicker of genuine fear in them. That's just a story, Detective. A legend the patients tell to scare each other. The records from that time are unreliable. St. Augustine's has a long, troubled history. A history you seem to want to keep buried, Miles pressed, his voice sharp. 3 staff members are dead, Dr. Shaw, and a rosary and a white rose were found at each scene, things the legend of Sister Beatrice is associated with. Dr. Shaw's hands, which had been resting calmly on her desk, began to tremble. She looked away, her gaze fixed on a distant point outside the window. I can't help you with this, Detective. My knowledge is limited to my time here. Your time here is 30 years, Doctor, Miles insisted, leaning forward. That's a long time to ignore a history that is now, quite literally, killing people. She finally turned to face him, her eyes filled with a desperate weariness. You don't understand, Detective. The stories, they're not just stories. There was a reason St. Augustine's fell into disrepair. A reason no one ever wanted to truly fix it. Some things are best left alone. What things? Miles demanded. The truth? Before Dr. Shaw could answer, a frantic knock sounded on her office door. A young, visibly shaken nurse burst in, her face pale. Dr. Shaw, it's Mr. Henderson. He's had a heart attack. In the West Wing. Miles's heart sank. Another victim. The fourth. Mr. Henderson was the head of maintenance, a man who had worked at St. Augustine's for over 40 years, the oldest living employee. He had been the one to report the malfunctioning cameras. The timing was too perfect, too deliberate. The killer was sending a message, a cruel and undeniable one. They were closing in. I need to go, Dr. Shaw said, her voice trembling as she stood up. She shot Miles a look that was a mixture of fear and a plea for help. I've told you all I can. As Dr. Shaw hurried out, Miles followed her, his mind racing. This wasn't just a pattern of revenge, it was a targeted purge. The victims weren't random, they were connected to the institution's dark past. And now, the last link to that history, the head of maintenance, was dead. The killer was not just taking lives, they were systematically erasing a history that someone, somewhere, wanted to keep hidden. Miles knew he had to find the truth before the next whisper became a scream, before the next host became another grave. The news of Mr. Henderson's death hit the asylum like a shockwave. Fear, a quiet companion in the halls, now walked with a swagger, its presence a palpable weight on everyone's shoulders. Miles and Elena, a grim duo, stood over the maintenance chief's body. The scene was a grotesque echo of the previous ones. No signs of struggle, no obvious cause of death, just a face frozen in a rictus of terror. On his desk, a single dried white rose. In his hand, a small polished wooden rosary, the beads warm to the touch. 4 deaths, Elena said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. All high-ranking staff, the most recent being the oldest. Whoever is doing this is working their way up a chain of command, or maybe a chain of knowledge. They're silencing everyone who knows something. Miles was no longer concerned with the how of the murders. His focus was now entirely on the why. He knelt by the desk, his eyes scanning the cluttered space. Unlike the other victims' offices, Henderson's was a chaotic jumble of tools, blueprints, and repair logs. Miles's gaze fell upon a dusty ledger tucked away in a corner behind a stack of old plumbing manuals. The cover was a dark, faded leather, and the pages were brittle with age. "What's this?" he asked, pulling it out. The binding creaked as he opened it. Inside, in a neat, flowing script, were meticulous records of the asylum's maintenance from the late 1930s. This was no ordinary log. It was a personal diary of sorts, detailing the structural flaws, the hidden passages, and the countless repairs. At the bottom of one of the first pages, Miles found a name. S.B. Dubois. "It's hers," Miles breathed, a jolt of adrenaline coursing through him. Sister Beatrice's ledger. She wasn't just an archivist, she was also documenting the asylum's physical state. She knew this place inside and out. Elena leaned in, peering over his shoulder. Why would she do that? A nun in charge of maintenance records? Because she was meticulous, Miles reasoned, his mind connecting the dots. She was the true historian of this place. She documented everything, not just the patients, but the very bones of the building. Henderson must have had this, or at least known about it. It's the key to everything. As they flipped through the pages, they found a startling entry dated June 1941. The handwriting, usually so calm and precise, was frantic and spidery. "The devil walks among us, not in the cells, but in the halls of power. They come at night, 12 of them, to perform their grim work. 12 hosts, a grim parody of the sacred. The blood is on their hands, not the patient's." 12 hosts, Elena whispered, her face pale. "This isn't just about the asylum, it's about something else." Miles's eyes scanned the next few pages. The entries became even more cryptic, filled with feverish accusations and desperate pleas for divine intervention. Then, a chilling discovery. Sister Beatrice had detailed the location of a series of hidden passages throughout the asylum, passages she had used to observe the staff and document their transgressions. The ledger contained a crude but detailed map of the secret network, detailing hidden observation points in the administrative wing, the patient wards, and even the morgue. She was a spy, Miles said, the realization hitting him with full force. She wasn't just a nun, she was documenting something illegal, something sinister, something that led to the deaths of 12 patients and eventually to her own. The information in the ledger was a gold mine, but it also painted a target on their backs. The killer knew they were getting closer, and they were willing to kill to keep this history buried. As if on cue, Dr. Shaw rushed into the room, her face ashen. "Detective, a message," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The police department just received a phone call, an anonymous tip. They knew you were here. They said the next host is ready." A cold dread settled in Miles's stomach. The killer wasn't just reactive. They were taunting them. They knew Miles and Elena were onto them, and they were enjoying the game. "Who received the call?" Miles asked, his voice low and dangerous. "A dispatcher, Doctor," Shaw replied, her hands trembling. "They said, the priest's home is a tomb for the living. The 12 hosts have been forgotten, but the 13th will be remembered." Miles's mind flashed to the 12 patients who had died in 1941. 12 hosts. And now the 13th. A new victim, a new message. "The priest's home," Eleanor said, her eyes widening. "St. Augustine's was built on the site of a monastery, wasn't it? The old priest's quarters are still there, in the basement, just beneath the chapel." Miles and Eleanor exchanged a grim look. They knew they had to get there, but the killer had laid a trap. They were walking into the lion's den. "We need backup," Miles stated, pulling out his phone. "This is no longer just a murder investigation, it's a chase." "Backup might be too late," Elena said, her gaze fixed on the cryptic message. "The 13th will be remembered. This isn't just a threat. It's a statement. They're doing this for a reason, to expose something. We need to find the 13th host before the killer does, and we need to find out what they have to do with Sister Beatrice's history." As they rushed out of the maintenance room, leaving the macabre scene behind, Miles felt the weight of the city's history pressing down on him. The asylum, with its dark secrets and ancient ledgers, was a living, breathing entity. And Sister Beatrice, the Macabre Nun, was not just a ghost story. She was a witness, a victim, and perhaps a vengeful spirit guiding them through the labyrinth of a horrifying past. The 13th host was the final piece of the puzzle, and Miles knew, with a dreadful certainty, that this would be the final, terrifying confrontation. The descent into the asylum's underbelly felt like a journey into the city's forgotten heart. The air grew colder, heavier, filled with the scent of damp stone and a history that had festered in the dark for decades. Miles and Elena, their flashlights cutting through the thick blackness, navigated the narrow, winding corridors beneath St. Augustine's. The map from Sister Beatrice's ledger was their only guide, a crude but precise blueprint of a secret world. "This place is a maze," Elena muttered, her voice tight. The echoes of their footsteps seemed to mock them, the silence a constant, unnerving presence. "It was designed to be," Miles replied, his senses on high alert. "A perfect place to hide things. Or people." The message, "The priest's home is a tomb for the living," replayed in his mind. The 13th host. A new victim, but a different kind of victim. Not a staff member, not a ghost. Miles had a chilling premonition that the 13th host wasn't a person, but a final, macabre tableau. They found the entrance to the priest's quarters exactly where the ledger indicated, a loose stone behind an altar in the chapel's basement. The stone gave way with a grunt, revealing a hidden stairwell that led even deeper into the earth. The air that rushed out was stale and heavy, and a low, guttural moan seemed to whisper from the depths. Miles and Elena drew their sidearms, their flashlights trained on the darkness below. They descended, their footsteps a muted crunch on the debris-strewn floor. The passage opened into a large, circular chamber. In the center, a single chair sat bathed in a single beam of light from a crack in the ceiling. A figure was tied to the chair, their head slumped forward. It was Dr. Evelyn Shaw. Her face, when they drew closer, was a mask of terror, her eyes wide open and staring into a darkness only she could see. She was unconscious, but alive. A single, white rose was pinned to her blouse, and a wooden rosary was clutched in her hand. "She's alive," Miles said, relief and dread warring in his voice. The 13th host wasn't a victim, she was a witness. A living witness. "Miles, look," Elena said, her flashlight beam sweeping the room. The walls were covered in old, faded charcoal drawings, dozens of them. They were portraits, crude and childlike, but hauntingly recognizable. The faces of the 12 victims who had died in 1941. And at the bottom of each portrait, a name. Miles recognized them from the patient records they had been digging through. There was a final drawing, larger than the others, at the center of the wall. It depicted 12 shadowy figures in robes surrounding a central figure, a nun, Sister Beatrice. And the faces of the figures in robes were hauntingly familiar. They were the faces of the Asylum's administration from the 1940s, the 12 hosts. They had been 12 people, a secret cabal, who were performing some kind of ritual. "It's a ritual," Miles whispered, his voice hoarse. "Not a murder. They were performing some kind of macabre ritual, and they were using the patients as sacrifices." Elena's eyes widened in horror as she looked at the final drawing. And look at the last one, the 13th drawing. Her flashlight focused on a new portrait, crudely drawn in fresh charcoal. It was Dr. Evelyn Shaw, and next to her, a small dark sketch of a figure with a knife, and the initials LC. "LC," Miles said, his mind racing. "Who is LC?" As if on cue, a voice, a low and menacing whisper, echoed through the chamber. "The one who remembers. The one who will finish what Beatrice started." A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, gaunt man in a janitor's uniform. His face was a mask of calm, cold fury. It was Mr. Larson, one of the asylum's longest-serving janitors, a quiet, unassuming man. "Larson," Miles said, his hand tightening on his gun. "What have you done?" "I have given them what they deserve," Larson replied, his voice chillingly calm. "I have brought justice to a place where it was denied. They were not just 12 victims, Detective. They were the 12 hosts, the 12 founders of a cult of perversion and deceit. They used St. Augustine's as their personal playground, their personal morgue. My mother was one of their victims. Her name was Miles Corbin." Miles felt a shock go through him. Miles Corbin, his mother. She had been a patient at St. Augustine's, a detail he had long buried. a painful memory he had tried to forget. She had died in 1941, listed as having a heart attack, the same as the victims. "My mother was one of the 12, Miles said, the words a raw whisper. "Lila Corbin." Larson's face, which had been a mask of rage, softened slightly. "Not the victims, Detective. The 12 hosts. Your mother wasn't a victim. She was part of it. A member of the inner circle. She was the 13th host, the one who betrayed the others, who brought Sister Beatrice's work to an end. But she was silenced before she could reveal the truth." A horrifying realization dawned on Miles. The white rose, the rosary, the meticulous, sterile scenes. It wasn't an act of murder. It was an act of a copycat, a tribute to a method of execution. But it wasn't Sister Beatrice's. It was the method used by the 12 hosts to silence the patients and to silence the one who betrayed them. Larson pulled a small, wicked-looking knife from his pocket. "I have spent my life here, Detective, cleaning up their mess, listening to the whispers. I have been waiting for the day when I could finish what Sister Beatrice started and give them a taste of their own medicine." He lunged at Miles, his face a mask of a religious fervor gone horribly wrong. The fight was quick and brutal. Larson, despite his age, was driven by a powerful, consuming rage. Miles, however, had the element of surprise and the training of a seasoned detective. He managed to disarm Larson, pinning him against the wall. "It ends now, Larson," Miles said, his voice ragged. "No more graves, no more hosts." Larson, his rage spent, slumped to the floor, defeated. "You don't understand," he said, his voice a broken whisper. "It was a secret, a conspiracy. They weren't just killing them. They were harvesting them, for their own personal gain, for their own lives. They were a cult of death, and they were led by the one who was supposed to heal them. Dr. Alistair Finch's father, the original Alistair Finch. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The generational link, the cult, the ritual, the 12 patients, the 12 hosts. The 13th host, his own mother, Lila Corbin. And the killer, Larson, the son of a victim, seeking vengeance for a crime long forgotten. Miles looked at the unconscious Dr. Shaw, then at the eerie drawings on the wall. He knew what he had to do. He had to expose the truth no matter how painful it was. He had to bring the forgotten to light and finally give them their rest. The case of Sister Beatrice, the Macabre Nun, was not just about solving murders. It was about exposing a conspiracy, about healing a wound that had festered for decades, and about finding peace for the forgotten. The city, with its secrets and its shadows, had finally revealed its true face. And Miles, a detective, a son, and now a witness, knew that the real terror was not in the supernatural, but in the depths of human depravity. With Larson in custody and Dr. Shaw safely in the hands of paramedics, the asylum's dark history began to unravel at a dizzying pace. The police, initially skeptical, were faced with the undeniable evidence. Sister Beatrice's ledger, Larson's confession, and the harrowing drawings on the walls of the priest's quarters. The truth was far more horrifying than any ghost story. Miles and Elena returned to the precinct, the weight of the events heavy on their shoulders. The city's press, hungry for a story, descended on the asylum, their cameras flashing, their questions sharp and unrelenting. Miles, however, stayed out of the spotlight, his focus on the deeper, more personal truth he had uncovered. His mother, Lila Corbin, a victim of a crime long buried, a secret so dark it had led to a new wave of death. Miles sat across from Larson in the interrogation room, the fluorescent light casting a harsh glare on the janitor's haggard face. Larson, no longer the menacing figure from the asylum, was a broken man, a vessel of decades of repressed rage and pain. "Why?" Miles asked, his voice low. "Why now? After all these years? Larson's gaze was distant, as if he were seeing something far away. The new administration, Dr. Finch, Dr. Finch's son, and his 2 associates. They were all descendants of the original 12 hosts. They were planning to reopen the old wing, the one that's been sealed off for 50 years, the one where they performed their rituals. A chilling realization washed over Miles. The pattern. The murders weren't just about silencing people. They were about stopping a new generation from repeating the sins of the past. The victims, Dr. Alistair Finch, Dr. Alistair Finch's son, and his associates, weren't just prominent staff members. They were the new hosts, the new cabal, poised to continue their family's grotesque legacy. They were going to continue the ritual, Miles said, the words a bitter taste in his mouth. What was the ritual? What was its purpose? Larson's eyes, filled with a terrible sorrow, met Miles's. It was a ritual of transference. They believed they could transfer their ailments, their sicknesses, even their own deaths, to the patients. They called them the hosts, because they believed the patients would host their illnesses, their madness, and their own mortality, allowing the hosts to live forever. Miles felt a knot tighten in his stomach, the true horror of it, the psychological torment, the abuse of power, the ultimate betrayal of trust. The asylum, a place of healing, had become a temple of perversion. And my mother, Miles said, his voice trembling, Lila Corbin. What was her role? Your mother was a nurse, Larson said, his voice softening. She was part of the cabal, but she was horrified by what they were doing. She documented everything, just like Sister Beatrice. She was the one who went to the authorities. She was the one who exposed them. She was their 13th host, the one who brought them down from within. But before she could reveal everything, they silenced her. They killed her in the same way they had killed the others. A heart attack. A quiet, clinical murder. And they took the evidence she had collected and buried it. They buried it with her, in a secret grave somewhere on the asylum's grounds. Miles's mind reeled. His mother wasn't a victim of a heart attack. She was a martyr. She had fought to expose a horrifying truth, and she had paid for it with her life. The pain of the past, a silent, festering wound, now bled into the present, a raw, open sore. The white rose, Miles said, his voice flat. The rosary. You were using the same symbols they used to kill her, to taunt them, to let them know you knew. Larson nodded. I was. They were symbols of my mother's faith, her innocence, and her death. I had to let them know I was coming for them. I had to let them know they couldn't hide forever. I had to finish what she started. Miles looked at the broken man before him, not a killer, but a survivor, a man who had been consumed by a history so dark it had driven him to madness. Where is it? Miles asked, his voice low. The evidence. Where did they bury it? Larson's eyes, which had been so full of sorrow, now held a glint of defiance. I'll tell you. But first, you have to promise me something. You have to tell the world the truth. You have to expose what they did. You have to make sure they are remembered for what they were. Not as doctors, not as caregivers, but as murderers. Miles looked at the man, at his desperation, at the terrible weight he had been carrying for so long. He knew he had to do it. He had to give his mother her voice back. He had to give the forgotten patients their justice. I promise, Miles said, his voice a solemn vow. The world will know the truth. I will not let their legacy be forgotten. Larson, a flicker of relief in his eyes, began to speak. He described a secluded section of the asylum's grounds, an overgrown, forgotten corner where a small, unmarked grave lay hidden. The 13th grave, the one for the 13th host, the one that held not a body, but the buried evidence of a horrifying conspiracy. As Miles and Elena drove to the location, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in a bruised palette of purples and reds. The asylum, with its Gothic silhouette, seemed to stand against the twilight, its secrets finally brought to light. The case of Sister Beatrice was no longer a mystery. It was a testament to the darkest parts of human nature, a reminder that the real monsters were not in the shadows, but in the very hearts of those who wielded power. Miles, a detective, a son, and a witness, was ready to face the truth, to unearth the final piece of the puzzle, and to finally lay the past to rest. The old asylum grounds were a maze of overgrown weeds and forgotten monuments. The setting sun cast long, skeletal shadows, making the very air feel thick with a sense of morbid history. Following Larson's directions, Miles and Elena navigated the treacherous landscape, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The location he had described was a secluded corner of the property, a section that had been left to the wilderness for decades, far from the manicured lawns and public-facing facade of the institution. "This is it," Elena said, her voice a hushed whisper. They stood before a small, unmarked patch of earth, a slight mound in the ground, almost completely swallowed by a thicket of thorns and tangled vines. The air here was colder, heavier, a silent sentinel of a past long buried. Miles knelt, his hands working to clear the stubborn weeds. He felt a sense of reverence, a powerful connection to the woman whose secrets he was about to unearth. His mother, Miles Corbin, the 13th host, the one who had stood up to a conspiracy of perversion and paid the ultimate price. After a few minutes of digging, his shovel struck something hard, a wooden box, its surface waterlogged and covered in a thick layer of mud. It was old but sturdy. Miles and Elena, working together, managed to pull it out. The box was sealed with a rusty latch. Miles, with a deep breath, opened it. Inside, wrapped in a brittle, faded cloth, was a collection of personal items, a physical testament to a life lived in silent rebellion. There were handwritten journals, a small worn photograph of a young Miles and his mother, and a series of meticulously organized files. Miles's hands trembled as he opened the first journal. The handwriting, elegant and precise, was his mother's. The entries began in 1939, detailing her growing unease with the asylum's administration, her suspicion that something sinister was happening behind closed doors. She wrote of the strange, secretive meetings of the 12 administrators, the unexplained deaths of the patients, the quiet fear that permeated the halls. In the final entries, her tone was one of frantic desperation. She wrote of her discovery, a secret society, a cult of transference, who were using the patients as vessels for their own ailments. She detailed their macabre rituals, their cold, clinical approach to murder, their utter lack of humanity. Then, the final entry, dated in late 1941, was a stark and terrifying account of a meeting with the group. She had threatened to expose them. They had threatened her, and in her final words, she wrote, "They know. They will silence me just as they silenced the others. I have hidden the truth here where they will never look for it. For my son. For justice. For the forgotten." Miles felt a hot tear roll down his cheek. He had always believed his mother had died of a broken heart, a quiet, forgotten soul in a desolate place. Now he knew the truth. She was a hero, a warrior, a woman who had stood up to the forces of darkness and sacrificed her life for the truth. The files, meticulously organized, were even more damning. They contained detailed reports of the patient's deaths, with notes from his mother detailing the exact time and cause of each death, notes that were completely at odds with the official reports. There were blueprints of the asylum, with secret passages and hidden rooms marked with her own hand, and most importantly, there was a series of photographs. The photographs, faded and grainy, showed the 12 administrators, a cabal of respected doctors and officials, performing their grotesque rituals. They were dressed in black robes, their faces a mask of eerie serenity, as they stood over the bodies of the deceased patients. The final photograph showed them standing over his mother, a look of grim triumph on their faces. Miles stared at the photograph, a cold rage building in his heart. The faces of the perpetrators, so respectable in their official portraits, now seemed to twist and contort into grotesque caricatures of evil. "This is it," Miles said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "The evidence, the proof." Eleanor, her face a mask of shock and awe, took the files from him, her hands trembling. "This changes everything. We're not just solving a murder case. We're exposing a conspiracy that spans generations." As they made their way back to the car, a sudden, piercing wail echoed through the asylum grounds. It wasn't the sound of a patient, it was the sound of a police siren. A patrol car, its lights flashing, was speeding towards them. Miles's heart sank. He knew what this was. The new administration, with its ties to the old regime, had found a way to silence them. They had planted a trap. They were trying to get to the evidence before they could reveal it. A voice, amplified by a loudspeaker, boomed through the night. "Detective Miles Corbin and Detective Elena Ramirez, drop your weapons and the evidence. You are under arrest for the murder of Mr. Larson." Miles and Elena exchanged a grim look. They were trapped. The past, with its sinister legacy, was reaching out to silence them, just as it had silenced his mother. But Miles, with the weight of the evidence in his hands, was not about to back down. He was no longer just a detective, he was a son, fighting for his mother's honor, a crusader for a truth that had been buried for too long. "We need to get this to the station," Miles said, his voice determined. "We can't let them win, not again." As they ran through the labyrinthine asylum grounds, Miles felt the spirits of the forgotten hosts surrounding him, their silent pleas for justice a powerful force. The ghosts of the past were no longer a myth. They were a motivation, a reason to keep fighting. The case of Sister Beatrice, the Macabre Nun, was not over yet. The final, terrifying confrontation was just beginning. The patrol car's siren wailed, a shrill, piercing cry that cut through the silent night. Miles and Elena, with the wooden box clutched in Miles's hand, sprinted through the asylum grounds, their hearts pounding in their chests. The manicured lawns and stately trees, once symbols of a dignified institution, now seemed like a grotesque mockery of a place that had become a temple of perversion. "They're coming from all directions," Elena gasped, her breath a ragged cloud in the cold air. "They're not just police officers," Miles said, his mind racing. "They're part of it. The new administration. They've been watching us, waiting for us to find it." He was right. As they rounded a corner, they saw a familiar figure step out from behind a large oak tree. It was Dr. Evelyn Shaw, the asylum's director. Her face, usually so composed, was contorted into a mask of cold fury. "You should have left it alone, Detective Corbin," she said, her voice a low hiss. "Some secrets are meant to stay buried." "The truth is never meant to be buried, Dr. Shaw," Miles retorted, his voice a low, steady rumble. "And neither are the dead." "Doctor," Shaw laughed, a short, bitter sound. "The dead are just a memory. The living are a problem. And you, Detective, have become a very big problem." She signaled to the other officers who began to close in on them, their faces grim and unyielding. The trap was set. They were surrounded. "There's only one way out," Miles said, his eyes scanning the asylum's facade. "The old wing. The one Larson said they were planning to reopen." Elena's eyes widened in realization. "The one with the secret passages. Sister Beatrice's map." Miles nodded. The map in the ledger was their only hope. A final, desperate gambit. They ran towards the old wing, a dilapidated section of the asylum that had been sealed off for decades. Its windows were boarded up, its doors chained shut. But Miles knew from the map in the ledger that there was a secret entrance, a small hidden door that led into the labyrinthine network of passages. They found it exactly where the ledger said it would be, a false wall behind a large, forgotten statue of a saint. The false wall, with a grunt and a groan, gave way, revealing a dark, claustrophobic passage. "This is it," Miles said, his voice strained. "We go in, we lose them, and we get this evidence to the station." They scrambled inside, just as the officers, led by Dr. Shaw, broke through the chained doors of the old wing. The passage was a narrow, winding tunnel, its walls slick with moisture, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. Miles and Elena, their flashlights cutting through the thick blackness, navigated the treacherous passage, using the crude map in the ledger as their guide. The passage led them deeper and deeper into the asylum's bowels, a silent journey into the heart of darkness. They finally emerged in a small, hidden room. It was a dusty, forgotten office, a relic of a bygone era. A small brass plaque on the door read, "Sister B. Dubois." "Her office," Elena whispered, a sense of awe in her voice. "This is where she worked. This is where she documented everything." The room was filled with more journals, more files, more evidence of the asylum's dark past. But one item, in particular, caught Miles's eye. It was a large, leather-bound volume, a history of St. Augustine's. He opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. The final entry, dated in late 1941, was a confession. It was written by the head of the cabal, the original Dr. Finch, detailing the full extent of their atrocities. He wrote of their ritual, of their belief in transference, of their quiet murders. He wrote of the 13th host, Miles Corbin, and her betrayal. He wrote of his regret, his shame, his guilt. And then, a chilling revelation, he wrote that the conspiracy had not ended, that the knowledge of the ritual had been passed down from generation to generation, and that the new administration led by his son was poised to continue the work. The 12 hosts, a legacy of death and perversion spanning decades. Miles felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The conspiracy was not just a historical event, it was a living, breathing entity, an unseen force that had been working in the shadows for over 80 years. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed from the passage. Dr. Shaw and her accomplices had found them. They were trapped. "Give me the box, detective," Dr. Shaw said, her voice cold and devoid of emotion. "And I will make this quick and painless." Miles clutched the box tighter, his mind racing. He was cornered with no way out. But then he remembered something his mother had written in her journal, a small, cryptic note about a final escape. He looked at the room, his eyes scanning every detail. He saw it. A small, almost invisible crack in the wall, hidden behind a loose bookshelf. It was a final, desperate gambit, a one-way ticket to freedom. "I'm not going to let you win, Dr. Shaw," Miles said, his voice firm. "The truth will be known." He pulled the bookshelf away, revealing a small, hidden door that led to a narrow, winding passage. He pushed Elena inside, then followed her, just as Dr. Shaw and her men burst into the room. The last thing he saw was Dr. Shaw's face, a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, as she realized she had been outsmarted. The passage led them to a small hidden hatch in the asylum's main chapel. They emerged into the open, the first rays of dawn painting the sky in a bruised palette of reds and purples. The city, with its silent, sleeping population, seemed to mock their ordeal. But Miles knew that the city's slumber was about to be broken. Miles and Elena, exhausted but resolute, walked towards the precinct, the box of evidence clutched in Miles's hand. The case of Sister Beatrice, the Macabre Nun, was no longer a mystery. It was a living, breathing conspiracy, and they were the ones who were going to expose it. The final terrifying confrontation had been fought, and they had won, for now. The real terror was not in the shadows, it was in the light of day. And Miles, a detective, a son, and a crusader, was ready to face it. The first light of dawn brought not just a new day, but a seismic shift in the city's quiet rhythm. Miles and Elena, their clothes caked in mud and their faces grim with exhaustion, burst into the precinct, the wooden box of evidence a physical weight of their triumph. The desk sergeant, accustomed to their weary arrival after a long night, took one look at their faces and knew this was different. Miles didn't stop to explain. He marched directly to his captain's office, the weight of the past propelling him forward. Captain Reynolds, a seasoned veteran with a jaded eye, looked up from his desk, a look of tired surprise on his face. "Corbin, Ramirez," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You look like you've been to hell and back. Where's Larson?" "Larson's in custody," Miles said, placing the wooden box on the captain's desk. "But that's the least of it, sir. This box contains the truth about St. Augustine's Asylum. The deaths, the conspiracy, everything." Captain Reynolds, his skepticism a well-worn coat, picked up the box. He opened it, his eyes scanning the yellowed journals and grainy photographs. His expression, which had been one of mild irritation, slowly transformed into one of stunned disbelief. "My God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. This is unbelievable." "It's all here, Captain," Eleanor said, her voice tight with emotion. "The confessions, the evidence of the ritual, the names of the original cabal, and the new one. Dr. Shaw and her associates, they're all part of it." The captain, a man who had seen his share of depravity, was visibly shaken. He looked at Miles, then at Elena, a silent question in his eyes. "We need to get this to the DA's office," Miles said, his voice firm. "We need to expose this conspiracy. We need to get a warrant for Dr. Shaw and her accomplices." Captain Reynolds, however, hesitated. He looked at the box, then at the weary faces of his detectives. "Miles, Elena, this is a lot. This could ruin a lot of powerful people. The Finch family has been a pillar of this city for generations. This could tear the city apart." "The truth is more important than reputation, sir," Miles insisted, his voice unwavering. "My mother, she died trying to expose this. She was a hero, and the people who killed her and a dozen others need to be brought to justice." The captain, a man of conscience, finally nodded. "You're right. I'll get the DA on the phone. This is going to be a long day." As Miles and Eleanor walked out of the office, they felt a sense of relief. A powerful weight lifted from their shoulders. The ghosts of the past, the forgotten hosts, were finally going to get their justice. But their relief was short-lived. As they were making their way to the evidence room, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was Lieutenant Davis, a high-ranking officer in the department, a man who was widely respected and admired. His face, however, was a mask of cold hostility. "Corbin, Ramirez," he said, his voice a low hiss. "The captain told me about your little discovery. I'm afraid I have to take that box into my custody." Miles's heart sank. A betrayal from within. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, this is a crime scene. This evidence needs to be processed." "I am aware of my duties, Detective," Davis said, his voice laced with menace. "But a case like this, it requires a more delicate touch. I'll be taking it from here." Miles felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The conspiracy wasn't just confined to the asylum. It had tentacles that reached deep into the city's power structures, even into the police department. Davis, with his impeccable reputation and his ties to the city's elite, was part of it. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Lieutenant," Miles said, his hand resting on his gun. "This evidence stays with us." Davis's eyes narrowed. "Don't make this difficult, Miles. This is not a request. It's an order." Miles, however, was not intimidated. He had faced down a conspiracy that had been killing people for 80 years. He wasn't about to back down from a corrupt cop. "You're making a mistake, Lieutenant," Miles said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is not about the past. It's about the present, and you're about to be part of it." Davis, a flicker of something in his eyes, lunged at Miles, his hand reaching for the box. Miles, with the training of a seasoned detective, sidestepped him, and with a swift move, he pinned Davis against the wall. "You're done, Davis," Miles said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You're not going to take this evidence. You're not going to bury the truth, not again." As Miles held him, Davis's face twisted in rage. "You have no idea what you've done, Corbin. You've just signed your own death warrant, and hers." He gestured towards Elena. "You've just declared war on a legacy, and legacies always win." Miles ignored him. He and Elena, their faces grim, dragged Davis to a holding cell, then marched back to the captain's office. "Captain," Miles said, his voice strained, "we have a problem. Davis, he's part of it." Captain Reynolds, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief, looked at them, then at the box. He had known Davis for years, had trusted him, respected him. The betrayal was personal, a deep wound in the fabric of their lives. "My God," he whispered, "how deep does this go?" "Deeper than we thought, sir," Miles said, his voice flat. "It's not just a conspiracy, it's a legacy, and we're not just fighting a crime, we're fighting a history." The captain, a man who had always prided himself on his integrity, looked at the box, then at Miles and Elena. A flicker of something, a powerful resolve, hardened in his eyes. "We're going to get a warrant for every person on that list," he said, his voice firm. "And we're going to have them all arrested. We're going to tear this legacy down piece by piece. We're going to do what should have been done 80 years ago." Miles felt a sense of relief, a powerful surge of hope. The ghosts of the past, the forgotten hosts, were finally going to get their justice. And Miles, a detective, a son, and a crusader, was going to be there to see it happen. The case of Sister Beatrice, the Macabre Nun, was no longer just a mystery. It was a crusade. And they were just getting started. The city awoke to a storm of controversy. News of the St. Augustine's conspiracy broke with explosive force. The front pages were dominated by headlines screaming of a legacy of murder and a psychiatric cult. The grainy photographs from Miles's mother's box were plastered across every screen, showing the city's most respected families as they truly were, a cabal of cold-blooded killers. Miles and Elena became overnight heroes, their faces on television, their story of unearthing a dark truth, the talk of the city. But for Miles, the fame was hollow. He was focused on the one thing that mattered: justice. The DA's office, with the damning evidence from the box, moved quickly. Warrants were issued for Dr. Shaw, Lieutenant Davis, and the 2 other members of the new cabal. The city, which had been in a state of shock, watched with bated breath as the police, now led by a resolute Captain Reynolds, began their roundup. The arrests were swift and decisive. Dr. Evelyn Shaw, her cold facade shattered, was taken into custody from her home. Lieutenant Davis, his arrogance gone, was found hiding in a safe house. The others were apprehended with little resistance, their power and influence, once so formidable, now crumbling under the weight of the evidence. Miles, however, felt no sense of triumph. He was consumed by a different kind of dread. He knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the most important part of the case was not the arrests, but the aftermath. The truth had been revealed, but a history that had been buried for so long was not going to give up its secrets without a fight. He was right. As the city reeled from the revelations, a new story began to circulate. A whisper at first, then a full-blown rumor. It was a story of a supernatural entity, a spectral nun, who had been haunting the asylum for decades, guiding Miles and Elena and punishing the new hosts for their sins. The media, hungry for a new angle, seized on the story, blurring the lines between fact and fiction. Miles watched with growing horror as the truth, the raw, human truth, was slowly being transformed into a myth. The story of a brave woman who had fought a conspiracy of perversion was being replaced by a ghost story. His mother's legacy, the legacy of a hero, was being overshadowed by the legend of the Macabre Nun. Miles knew who was behind it. It was the legacy itself. The old powerful families with their connections and their wealth were not going to let their reputations be tarnished by the truth. They were going to use the media, their connections, and their influence to turn a human tragedy into a supernatural tale, a story that could be dismissed as fiction, as a myth. "They're trying to bury it again," Miles said to Elena, his voice tight with frustration. "They're trying to discredit the evidence, to make it look like we were guided by a ghost. They're trying to make us look insane." Elena, however, was focused on something else. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a photograph of the original cabal, the 12 hosts. "There's a face in the background, a woman in a nun's habit. It's Sister Beatrice. She's not a myth, Miles. She was a real person. She was a witness, and she had a partner." Miles's eyes widened in disbelief. He had assumed Sister Beatrice was just a historical figure, a martyr, but now he saw the truth. She was a witness, a partner, a collaborator. She had been working with someone to expose the truth. "The 13th host," Miles said, the realization hitting him with full force. "My mother. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a partner. She was the one who was working with Sister Beatrice. And when Sister Beatrice died, she took over. She continued the work." The realization was a powerful blow. His mother, a woman he had always seen as a victim, was in fact a fighter, a crusader. A woman who had carried the weight of a horrific secret and had paid for it with her life. Just then, his phone rang. It was Captain Reynolds. His voice was low and strained. "Miles," he said, his voice barely audible. "We have a problem. Dr. Shaw, she's dead. Apparent heart attack. In her cell." Miles' blood ran cold. He knew it wasn't a heart attack. The legacy, the unseen conspiracy, was still working. It was still killing. The arrests, the evidence, the publicity. It was all a ruse. The real perpetrators, the ones who had been hiding in the shadows for 80 years, were not going to let their secrets die with them. They were going to make sure the truth was buried for good. Miles, his hands trembling, looked at the photograph of his mother and Sister Beatrice. He knew, with a dreadful certainty, that the fight was not over. It had only just begun. The legacy, the unseen conspiracy, was not a ghost. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was going to do whatever it took to make sure the truth was buried forever. The case of Sister Beatrice, the Macabre Nun, was not just about solving murders. It was about fighting for the soul of the city, about fighting for a truth that was on the verge of being forgotten. And Miles, a detective, a son, and a crusader, was ready to face the final, terrifying confrontation. The death of Dr. Shaw in her cell, officially ruled a heart attack, was the final, brutal blow in a game of psychological warfare. The media, fueled by the sensational rumors of a vengeful ghost, now had its final, macabre piece of evidence. The story of a psychiatric cult was now a ghost story, a tale of a macabre nun who returned to claim her victims. The truth was being buried in a mountain of superstition and sensationalism. Miles, however, was not fooled. He knew the truth. Dr. Shaw's death was an act of a living, breathing conspiracy. It was a message, a warning. The original members of the cabal, those who had passed down the ritual and the secrets, were still out there. They were old, but they were not dead. They were a powerful, unseen force, a living legacy of death and perversion. Miles sat in his office, a cold coffee cup forgotten on his desk, his eyes fixed on the photograph of his mother and Sister Beatrice. He had been so focused on the past, on the history of the asylum, that he had failed to see the present. The unseen conspiracy, the real perpetrators, were the ones who had been pulling the strings all along. A knock on his door startled him. It was Captain Reynolds, his face grim and defeated. "Miles," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The case is being closed. Officially, all deaths have been attributed to the Sister Beatrice cult. The new administration is being acquitted of any criminal charges. The DA's office has caved." Miles felt a cold fury course through him. Caved? They had all the evidence, Captain, the journals, the photographs, the confession. "It's not about the evidence, Miles," Reynolds said, his voice laced with a bitter resignation. "It's about the power, the families involved. They've been pulling strings for generations. They've used their influence to discredit the evidence, to spin a tale of a vengeful ghost. The public, they want a good story, and a good story always trumps the ugly truth." Miles felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The city, his city, had been betrayed. The forgotten hosts, the victims of a horrifying conspiracy, were going to be forgotten again. His mother's legacy, the legacy of a hero, was going to be erased. "What about me?" Miles asked, his voice low and dangerous. "What about my testimony? What about my mother's journal?" "Your testimony will be considered unreliable," Reynolds said, his eyes filled with a terrible sorrow. "The department will put you on a leave of absence for psychological evaluation, to make it seem like you've been driven to madness by the events, just like the myth." Miles felt the weight of the city's betrayal pressing down on him. The police department, the DA's office, the media. They were all part of it. The unseen conspiracy, the living legacy, had won. But Miles, a detective who had always believed in justice, was not about to give up. He looked at the photograph of his mother and Sister Beatrice, their faces a testament to a truth that was on the verge of being forgotten. He had to do something. He had to fight for their honor, for their memory. He stood up, his mind racing. He knew the legacy would not rest until they had completely discredited him, until they had buried the truth for good. He had to be one step ahead of them. He went to the evidence room, a quiet, sterile place where the secrets of the city were stored. He had a final, desperate plan. He was going to expose the truth, but not through the official channels. He was going to use the very thing they were using against him, the media. He took the wooden box, the journals, the photographs. He made copies of everything. He knew he had to be careful. The legacy, the unseen conspiracy, was watching him. He drove to a secluded cafe, a place where he could be alone, where he could think. He sat down, the box on the table before him, and he began to write. He wrote of his mother, Miles Corbin, a hero who had sacrificed her life for the truth. He wrote of Sister Beatrice, a brave nun who had stood up to a cabal of killers. He wrote of the forgotten hosts, the victims of a horrifying conspiracy. And he wrote of the living legacy, the unseen conspiracy, that was still trying to bury the truth. He wrote a story of a detective who had gone rogue, a story of a son who was fighting for his mother's honor. He wrote a story that was so personal, so raw, so human, that it would resonate with the public. He knew that people would not believe a ghost story, but they would believe a story of a man's fight for justice. He sent the story to a journalist he knew, a woman who had a reputation for her integrity. He knew he was taking a risk, but he also knew it was his only chance. He had to fight for the truth, even if it meant sacrificing his career, his life. The next day, the story hit the front pages. The city, which had been in a state of quiet resignation, was jolted back to life. The story was not about a vengeful ghost. It was about a human tragedy. It was about a conspiracy that had been killing people for 80 years. It was about a mother who had fought for her son, and a son who was fighting for his mother's honor. The public, moved by the raw human truth of the story, rose up in protest. They demanded justice. They demanded that the case be reopened. The city, which had been so quick to forget, was now demanding to remember. The legacy, the unseen conspiracy, had been outsmarted. They had tried to bury the truth in a ghost story, but Miles, with his courage and his unwavering resolve, had exposed the truth in a human story. The case of Sister Beatrice, the Macabre Nun, was not just about solving murders. It was about fighting for the soul of the city, about fighting for a truth that was on the verge of being forgotten. And Miles, a detective, a son, and a crusader, had won. The forgotten hosts, the victims of a horrifying conspiracy, had finally been given their justice, and his mother's legacy, the legacy of a hero, was finally going to be remembered.